service on mental health, I want to give a brief content warning that I'm going to be sharing about a recent death by suicide of someone very close to my family. This topic can be difficult to discuss, but it's also vitally important to do so. Please do take care of yourself as feels right to you. If you or someone you know is struggling, one important resource to know about is that you can call or text 988. You all know 911. This is 988. Anytime, 24/7, from anywhere in the US to reach the toll-free and confidential suicide and crisis hotline. Lifeline, better named. People call 988 to talk about a lot of things. Thoughts of suicide, relationship struggles, economic worries, anxiety, sexual identity, drinking too much, drug use, feeling depressed, mental and physical illness, loneliness, trauma, and more. When life gets tough, it can feel overwhelming, but it can get better. Whatever problems you are dealing with, 988 is here to help. For now, here's some of my own story. On March 23rd, the morning of our daughter's 17th birthday, she donned a black dress of mourning, M-O-U-R-N, mourning. Our son Tommy had just returned from Pittsburgh after spending spring break at home the prior week. A bonus weekend home would typically warrant celebration, but this occasion was markedly different. It was a celebration of life. My son Tommy delivered a heartfelt eulogy, and I shared poignant music in remembrance of a beloved family friend's grandson, affectionately known by my stepdaughter as that wild redhead from 2 doors down, dearest Marty, my son's lifelong best friend. My son is in the NASCAR driver's costume, and Marty in the bloody murderous doctor uniform thing. Incredibly challenging circumstances shaped Marty's life from the outset, the details of which I will not specify here. Initially, he spent weekends and summers visiting his grandparents 2 doors down, while residing with his dad, Vince, in an apartment nearby. Marty's biological mom passed away when he was quite young, and though he briefly had a stepmom, their paths diverged when she and Vince parted ways. Vince, a recovering addict, lived with schizophrenia. He did his best to raise Marty. Our neighbors, Ben and Nancy, Marty's grandparents, assumed primary parental duties, with Marty often spending time at our home playing with Tommy, and Tommy spending a good amount of time at Ben and Nancy's. To quote Tommy, "I don't even have a memory of meeting Marty. We were just introduced and began playing together as babies." Daredevils. Tragically, Vince accidentally overdosed on his schizophrenia medication roughly a decade ago. His death deeply affected Marty. Marty was the first to find his dad unresponsive that morning. Many members and friends of this congregation lamented Vince's death in our joys and sorrows that next Sunday. I hadn't realized how much of a hero Vince had become in the local mental health community. He helped a lot of people in his work at the Frederick Way station. So following Vince's death, Marty primarily resided with his grandparents 2 doors down, but was also welcomed into the home of his former stepmom. A few years later, Marty's grandfather passed away. Marty grappling with ongoing struggles with his own mental health, including a recent diagnosis of bipolar disorder, increasingly exhibited troublesome behavioral issues, spending time with other troubled individuals, even serving some jail time as he took the fall for a crime committed by and with a very bad influence in his life. Thankfully, he moved on from that association and found solace in moments of joy and connection with good friends like Tommy, spending time together whenever Tommy was home from college. But the mental health challenges were worsening. Marty had recently confided in my son that he was haunted by the voices screaming in his head. During Tommy's most recent winter break home, Marty stayed with us to maximize their time together. Their last phone conversation was filled with anticipation for Tommy's upcoming spring break, brimming with plans for fishing, golfing, and other shared hobbies. We now know that morning marked the beginning of a day Marty would not finish. Several days later, we learned of his tragic death by suicide. The investigation revealed he had driven off in his iconic red pickup truck with his beloved hunting rifle and never returned. Marty's passing just a week before his 22nd birthday left many of us shocked and grappling with feelings of guilt and sorrow. In the face of such loss, our wise minister reminds us of the complexity of life, moments of hurt intertwined with moments of joy and caring and love. As we mourn Marty's passing, we are left with a sense of incompleteness. Yet amidst our grief, we also hold on to gratitude for the precious moments shared with him. He was a character. Though his journey ended prematurely, Marty's memory lives on in the hearts of those who knew and loved him. As we enter the minute of silence to follow, may we hold in our hearts all who are living with mental illness, health struggles, and all who are impacted by death by suicide. May we recommit ourselves to living with as much compassion as we can, compassion for ourselves, compassion for others, and compassion for this world.
Each summer, I carve out some time to plan our Sunday service topics for the whole upcoming congregational year. Around that time last year, I read this headline in the Frederick News Post. Experts, school officials concerned by worsening mental health survey data. This article was one of an increasing number of news items that I'd seen in recent years about troubling mental health trends, especially among young people nationwide. So I scheduled myself to preach a sermon on the topic this month, since May is Mental Health Awareness Month. Frankly, I was tired of reading articles about the problem, and I was saying, who out there is talking about solutions? I read quite a few books as background research, but one book in particular, published just a few months ago, stood out to me as the most helpful. The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. It's by Jonathan Haidt, who's a professor of social psychology at New York University. Have any of you read it? Or maybe heard a podcast interview with him about it? He's been on Making the Rounds. By no means am I saying that Haidt has all the answers. No one book does. But I found this book to be compelling as well as well-written and researched, and I encourage you to read it if this sermon leaves you curious to learn more. Haidt, to me, builds a fairly persuasive case that the biggest factor behind the current youth mental health crisis is the transition from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm no Luddite. I'm not opposed to new technologies, new ways of working. If anything, I tend to be wary of attempts to create moral panics around new technology. Indeed, I have 4 Apple products within 5 feet of me at this moment. I'm preaching from an iPad, as I have been for many years. I'm wearing an Apple Watch on my wrist. We're broadcasting this service to Zoom from my MacBook, and my iPhone is over there as well. Nevertheless, I think Haidt is onto something when he challenges us to consider that overprotection in the real world and underprotection in the virtual world are the major reasons why children born after 1995 have become the anxious generation. Why 1995? That means that you were at the formative age of 12 when the first iPhone was released, which was the first landmark in what Haidt calls the great rewiring of childhood. If we turn back the clock 14 years to 2007, how many of you remember this presentation by Steve Jobs? Okay, quite a few of you. He made one of the most stunning technology presentations of all time. He didn't announce what people expected, some fancy new iPod, stunning new innovation in phone technology, or some brand new way of browsing the internet. He unveiled a revolutionary new device that included all three of those features in a new, sleek, handheld device. For my nerds out there, it was like you could buy a tricorder, right? An early version, but still somewhat shockingly accurate. Anyway, more than the iPhone itself, however, it was two additional developments that made this new device addictive in general and particularly pernicious for adolescent brains that are not fully formed. First, 2 years later, so 2007, the iPhone, two years later in 2009, Facebook added the like button and Twitter added the retweet button. These and similar innovations created the possibility of viral content. That shift incentivized users to craft content to be ever more extreme in order to generate ever greater anger and disgust, which increased the likelihood of virality. Facebook and other platforms then kept throwing fuel on the fire by tweaking their algorithms to curate inflammatory content. A second development that made these new devices particularly detrimental for adolescent brains arrived the next year in 2010, front-facing cameras that made taking selfies really easy. This option radically increased pressure, especially among young people, to curate perceptions of oneself. As a result, the amount of reactions or lack thereof that one received to a selfie could be, in turn, exhilarating or devastating in all the comments. So we have this new device, this iPhone with this ironically lowercase I that in actuality is a source of tremendous narcissism. To say just a bit about developmental psychology, adolescents, especially like tweens and middle schoolers, if you can think back to when you were a tween or in middle school, that it's a time of synthesizing conventions around you. There's a saying in developmental psychology that for people at this early adolescent stage, when I see you seeing me, I construct the me I think you see. When I see you seeing me, I construct the me I think you see. So you're particularly vulnerable at that stage to things like selfies and social media and all of this. In college, we begin to, or after high school, you begin to reach a stage of greater capacity to individuate, to reflect, more able to work wisely and skillfully with these new technologies. At the same time, let's all be honest, it's hard for adults too. And I'm gonna preach a sermon about that on June 2nd. So that's coming on how this technology is scattering adult attention spans as well and making it difficult to do deep focused work, but you're not seeing the same spike in mental health, which is our focus for today. I invite you to consider, how have smartphones changed your life for the better and for the worse? And how has it changed the lives of those around you for the better and for the worse? Personally, I've always been pretty good with technology. Now, I'll occasionally have like a friend who's a computer science major and I'm like, whoa, you're way better at this stuff than I am. But I'm not the biggest early adopter. I didn't purchase an iPhone until 2010. My first iPhone was the iPhone 4, not the 1, 2, or 3. At that point, a number of features on the iPhone had just become increasingly alluring to me. You can think about when maybe you bought your first smartphone and why. I could list those reasons for you, but Apple doesn't need my help marketing its devices. At the risk of playing the role of Grandpa Simpson, back in my day, things were different. Let me give you 2 points of reference in my life that are increasingly unimaginable today, and you can think about your own changing relationship with technology over time. First, a little more than 20 years ago in 2003, I was in my final year of graduate school. I lived on the 3rd floor of my seminary's apartment building, and I accidentally dropped my phone straight down the stairwell, all 3 stairs, and it smashed at the bottom. But it was a flip phone, Motorola. It wasn't really that expensive. I didn't replace it for a few months, and without a cell phone, I got some amazing uninterrupted studying done. And I missed maybe 2 social opportunities as a result of literally being unreachable. Like, no one knew where I was. It was amazing. For the kids out there, note that to text back in the day, like to text an S, you had to press the 7 key like 4 times. This made texting on old school keypads quite a bit more cumbersome. A second point of reference is that a year or so later in 2005, this is before I met Megan, I bought my first house, and I did have a basic cell phone for making calls, but I intentionally did not have either cable or the internet at home. I only had Netflix, 3 discs at a time by mail, and it was a little bit anxiety when I'd like put that third one in the mail, and I'm like, I hope the postman brings me another one tomorrow, right? And books, of course, for entertainment, but that's it. And for the most part, truly, it was great. I only checked email when I was in the office. Now, it wasn't that long ago when it was much easier to just not be connected to the internet 24/7, to email, to social media. But in recent years, the lure of technology has become inexorable and ubiquitous. We know from studies of meditation and wellness, though, that it is healthy for your mind and your body and spirit to be here now. But half of all teenagers these days, and we're going to talk about adults in early June, half of all teenagers these days say that they are online, quote, almost constantly. Technology is increasingly tempting all of us at every age to be forever elsewhere. I've had to be so careful with technology around my almost 11-month-old. I keep my watch, it's on black, so it doesn't come on if I move it. But if my hand brushes my watch and it lights up or my phone screen lights up, he is like an eagle eye. It's just like on the screen, right? Who's seen a very young child do that, right? Just like drawn like a moth to a flame to those devices. And what I don't want in a few years is the situation of this New Yorker cartoon. The caption reads, "It's been so nice getting to interact with you these past 6 years. Here's your first device." The big tech companies are employing the best psychologists to employ all the psychological tricks they know to addict us to their products. And they are using the same old tricks that tobacco and oil companies have used for decades to abdicate responsibility. The primary reason that Haidt targets social media and smartphones is that between 2010 and 2015, there was a synchronized international increase in rates of adolescent anxiety and depression. A synchronized international increase. Older generations were much less affected because their brains were already more fully formed when they started using smartphones and social media. Remember, by 2010, there was increasingly widespread purchasing of smartphones combined with rear-facing cameras for selfies and social media companies adding these like and retweet buttons. Other global and national threats are, of course, exacerbating these conditions, but Haidt makes a persuasive case that the timing points to smartphones and social media as the biggest culprits. This rings true for me. I don't know if I can think of just one quick example from my own life. In 2010, I wrote a curriculum for a youth summer camp that I was leading, and it was on spiritual practices. And I proposed to the planning team that we collect all the smartphones at the beginning of the week. And I thought this was a no-brainer. I'm like, of course, we should just collect all the smartphones and we give them back. And I was stunned. Every single other youth minister thought that was the most absurd idea. That there's no way the young people, they would let us do it, and there's no reason to do it. But 2010, I remember that distinctly as we can't possibly let go. It was my first real sense that something is going awry here. There's quite a few interesting charts in Haidt's book. I'll limit myself to 2 representative ones. First, there has been a 145% increase in major depression among teenage girls since 2010. So you can see that line, that gray area in the middle, 2010. To 2015. And there's been a 161% increase among teenage boys. So you can see why Haidt started asking, what is it that changed in 2010 to start having these upward trends? In this next chart, you can see that the younger you were, so younger is at the top in blue, and then so 18 to 25, 26 to 34 coming down, 35 to 49, and then 50 plus in green at the bottom. You can see that the younger you were when smartphones and social media became ubiquitous, the greater impact there was on your age cohort as far as increasing anxiety and depression. To help combat these trends, Haidt has 4 recommendations he believes would help ameliorate the youth mental health crisis. The first is no smartphones before high school, approximately age 14. Give your kids basic phones, give them watches without internet access. It's much less dangerous. No social media before 16. Social media tends to be most pernicious for girls between ages 11 and 13, and most dangerous for boys from ages 14 to 15. Phone-free schools. I'm going to say more about that in a second. Far more childhood independence. Looking at this list, to some of you, this may feel overwhelming, like, how can we possibly do all that? Others of you, it may feel incredibly exciting, like, yes, let's do that. Either is fine. It's important to name that trying to swim against the tide as an individual can result in constant conflict with the young people in your life, like stipulated. For that reason, this situation is what is sometimes called a collective action problem. We need change at the level of systems and institutions and structures. Let me give you one specific example of what this can look like. There's a great article in the Washington Post. I'm like, you're writing my sermon for me? I love it. Thank you. Just this past week on how a Connecticut middle school won the battle against cell phones. Did any of you read it? Okay, see quite a few hands. The problem, as you can likely guess, was students using devices in class despite rules against it, and it creates just this situation of combat with each teacher. Like it just creates misery. Despite a rule against it, social media was exacerbating nearly every conflict among students, and in classes and at lunch, there was nothing but a sea of heads bent over screens. So the school purchased magnetically locking pouches for every student. Before school, every student has to put their phone in their pouch. Students keep their phones throughout the day, but they're locked in these pouches. The magnet will not let go. And at the end of the day, they unlock stations that release the magnet. Now it's about $30,000 to purchase. It's not nothing, but it's, in the case of emergencies, there's still at least one landline phone in every classroom. Students still have their teachers have their cell phones if they need to call 911. And the pouches are just made of synthetic rubber. If it's a genuine emergency, you can just cut them open. At the more than 2,000 schools using the pouches, there have been dramatic improvements. Students are more focused. They are building more in-person relationships with their classmates. Social media-fueled arguments have decreased, and students are taking shorter trips to the restroom because they were like spending 20 minutes in the bathroom on their phone, right? So now they're like, oh, might as well just come back after actually just doing what I said. I heard a similar story at the summer camp that I attended for many years, that they had to do something. They had to actually have the counselors check their phones at the office because the counselors, they just couldn't resist being on their phones. Instead, it's too hard. It's addictive. I should also briefly touch on the first half of Haidt's thesis. Overprotection in the real world and underprotection in the virtual world are the major reasons why children born after '95 have become the anxious generation. Just another brief story, like in my own life, how many of you went to summer camp? Like that was a huge, huge part of my life. I mean, I went like for 2 weeks and then for 4 weeks and then I was all summer. And that time, completely away from technology, right? The greatest technology to the outside world was letter writing, right? That was like all you had. And also I grew up, I know this is rare but I was and not something accessible to everyone, but I grew up on the end of a suburb, and I literally had acres of woods behind my house. And I would be back there for like 6 hours, just like in the woods doing stuff. And my parents didn't have the first clue where I was. And that's part of what Haidt thinks we've lost. Now, I'm not saying we need to go all the way to the other direction. This photo is of a real playground in Dallas, Texas, back in the day. I would 100% play on that. And that is obviously too dangerous, right? But Haidt is right that prior to the 1990s, children used to have a great deal of freedom to walk to school, to roam around neighborhoods, to get into conflicts, to resolve those conflicts, to invent games. And all of that began around first or second grade. There's a great deal of freedom for kids. Did messed up stuff sometimes happen? Yes, it did. But I think a middle way is possible, and we truly may need Congress to pass some reasonable childhood independence laws, because right now we have a situation where people will call the police on your kids, even though you're trying to experiment with free-range parenting. Indeed, I'm reminded of a passage from a biography I read a few years ago about our Unitarian forebear, Louisa May Alcott, who was born in 1832. It said that Abigail and Bronson, you remember Bronson Alcott, good friends with Emerson, that they allowed 3-year-old Louisa to, quote, wander freely in Boston as only boys could do the generation before. 3 years old. For now, I'll begin we're not allowing Jalen at 3 to do that, but anyway, we'll find a happy medium. For now, I'll begin moving toward my conclusion with just a few more notes of hope. In addition to limiting time on smartphones and social media, which is good for all of us, Haidt details some further practices that can dramatically increase mental health for all ages. The first is shared sacredness. That can take a lot of different forms depending on your family or individual preference around religious or spiritual traditions. But the upshot is that truly coming to UUCF regularly is good for your mental health. Like, it actually is. So, yeah. Embodiment. Find ways to get out of your head and into your body, whether that's your preferred sport or walking is another solid option, whatever works best for your body to get moving through the world. 3, silence, stillness, and focus. More time uninterrupted by technology and social media is also really good for you. Transcending the self. Practices like art and music, they get you out of yourself, your ego, and into flow states of creativity. And finally, finding awe in nature. Getting outside into nature can be incredibly healing and restorative. For now, as we live into May as Mental Health Awareness Month, may each of us do what we can to be gentle and kind with ourselves and to care for others around us as well as we have capacity. In that spirit, let's rise and embody your spirit. Let's sing together a hymn that really I think is appropriate for Mental Health Awareness Month, number 1053, How Could Anyone? We'll sing it through twice.